Blender 4.3 was released this week for the leading open source 3D modeling software, and there are a lot of new features in this version. First, we'll start with the Linux-specific improvements with Blender 4.3. Blender 4.3 now has an experimental option to use Vulkan to render the user interface. This is early stages of the new Vulkan support, so it might not provide the expected performance improvements just yet, but when it goes to full support, then it will likely be a bigger improvement over OpenGL. The next big thing for Linux users is that Blender 4.3 supports hardware-accelerated ray tracing on Linux using the open source HIP-RT or HIP-RT libraries from AMD. This could provide Linux users with faster render times for scenes or projects that have complex lighting or lots of reflections or a bunch of dynamic shadows if they have an AMD GPU. There's a ton of other features and improvements in Blender 4.3, and there's no way to cover everything. We don't have 45 minutes or more to cover it, and there's also like a lot of in addition to just being a certain amount, there's also a certain amount of effort and depth that you need to go into each one of those. We don't have time for that. But thankfully, Blender did make a video themselves on their YouTube channel, so I'll link that in the show notes if you want the full in-depth look at what is new. But for now, we'll cover some highlights of this release. So Blender 4.3 is adding multi-pass compositing support to the EEVEE real-time renderer, or just EV, I guess, is how you're supposed to say it. They've added also light and shadow linking in EV, bringing it to a feature parity with cycles. There's also a new brush management system using asset libraries, and they've updated some of the brushes as well as added new brushes and improved performance of brushes overall. There's also a ton of improvements to the Grease Pencil tool. In fact, they rewrote the whole thing to improve the performance. There's a new layer groups feature in Grease Pencil. It's also using the new brush asset system. Plus, there's a new tool to edit fill gradients and so much more. I mean, much more in general with Blender 4.3. This is basically just scratching the surface of all the stuff that is in this latest version of Blender 4.3. So if you want to learn more, of course, you'll find links in the show notes.